The Summa Perfectionis Magisterii, Part 2, a short essay by Bruce Mills, otherwise known as the Obligate Pedestrian. Although Section 11 was covered in the previous part, I will review it now as it will give some context for this part read alone. In the following, keep in mind that spirits often means essentially materials deposited after being driven off as vapours from a solid by heat, and bodies means solids left behind, not driven off. The usage is not precisely this, as quicksilver and sulphur are spirits, but these words are not entirely synonymous with mercury and sulphur, as in the modern elements of classical chemistry. Mercury is that which makes something fluid or malleable, and sulphur that which makes it solid and crumbly. Start of paraphrase. Section 11, concerning the diverse suppositions about this art made by diverse men and concerning their errors taken in general. Having refuted the arguments of the pure philosophers, who say that alchemy cannot be ontologically correct, it remains to consider those denying the empirical validity of alchemy as a practical science. We will consider the principles drawn from data by our detractors, and will also present some principles of our own. Some say that the techniques of alchemy are found in spirits, others say bodies, others salts or alums or niters or boraxes. Some writing about any or all of these have written well and others have written badly. From all of these we have collected the truth by cross-checking sources and doing experiments. This process has been rather expensive. Often I have been misled and confused and even become desperate in my study. I hope these people who have left an evil of misinformation in their books that lasts after their death will rot in hell for it. If I do not correct their errors here, then I deserve no better. The correct path does not have to be arcane and made artificially mysterious. I will try to explain clearly. On the other hand, the matter is not entirely simple either, and much has to be learned to follow what is going on. Regarding the philosopher's stone, those who say that to create it means to use spirits might say to use quicksilver, or might say to use sulphur or marcasite or magnesis or tuitia, mainly zinc oxide, or sell ammoniac. Others say it is bodies such as lead, glass, gems, salts, alums, niters, and boraxes. To each of these assertions there are proponents and opponents, both of which are often devoid of reason. End of paraphrase. Pseudo Geber is taking quite a swipe at a lot of people here for making a mess of the description and practice of alchemy. For the record, sell ammoniac is ammonium chloride. Salt means broadly any product of roasting followed by leaching. Keep in mind that in more modern terms a salt might be defined as any product of an acid-base reaction. It is historically a term much broader than sodium chloride table salt. Niters were sodium or potassium nitrate. Boraxes were derivatives of borax, which is hydrated sodium boron oxide. Also, sulphur can be used to mean something rather close to the element of fire. The sense needs to be determined from the context. Page 653, section 12, supposition in sulphur. Start of paraphrase. Section 12, concerning those denying the art through supposition in sulphur. Some people decided that not only could the philosopher's stone be manufactured from sulphur, but only by purification. That is, only by repeated sublimation could it be created, and so they spent a long time subliming sulphur, with perhaps some arsenic. And then, when this failed, after years of work, they declared the stone could not be manufactured by any means at all. Our response is that they gained little experience and understanding. It is unlikely that only sulphur is involved, and even if that was true, it is unlikely that only sublimation would be involved. Having tried only one material and one technique for one purpose, they are not in any position to claim that alchemy as a whole does not work. Further, the technique of burning and sublimation may not perfect but destroy. Some have looked more deeply, having removed the volatile or combustible components, have made a fixed earthy material, but this is just a glassy slag. Those who publish this as a result have released defective product. The same pattern continues with other materials, except that when using quicksilver or tuitias, it is much less labour due to the lack of combustible components. On the other hand, marcasite and magnesia have every kind of sulfurity. End of paraphrase. The core point that Pseudo Geber makes multiple and perhaps too many times seems valid enough. A central technique of the alchemist was to try to separate out a material into its components by either burning or, better, heating without flame. One process from this was to repeat the heating until something was obtained that was entirely unchanged, no matter how much heat was applied. While this might in some sense be seen as a basic material, much has been lost by being driven off. Interesting materials probably involve multiple bodies and spirits and techniques in their preparation. Start of paraphrase, section 16. Negating the art on account of administration of all spirits. Some people have studied the idea that interesting materials are likely to require the combination of bodies and spirits in the right proportions, and they have mixed various bodies and spirits and then heated the result, only to find that spirits are again driven off and the material left is of no interest. From this they say that the science of alchemy is rubbish. But of course, if you just mix the two, heating will separate them. To make a new material, you have to find a way to fix the spirit to the body. If you do not do this, then the spirit will not adhere to the body, but will flee from it on the application of heat. But, say the detractors, if you fix the spirit, it will just become an earth that does not melt, and so will not properly combine with the body. One response is that they have not properly considered the details of the reactions. End of paraphrase. I find Summa Perfectionis Magisterii to be interesting to read because I get from it what one might call a modern mindset, or rather a medieval scientific mindset. I feel that the points made about the detractors are potentially valid. On the other hand, they are fairly loosely stated and can sound a bit crankish. This might be excused if we suppose that Pseudo Geber has been fighting a long battle with pointless criticisms, but it would have been better if these laments had been left out. The writer gives a brief description of the objection and a brief description of the refutation, which amounts to that the detractor is not looking into the details of the science sufficiently. They are judging it superficially, perhaps after spending many years, but studying only one technique in isolation, like a person trying to make an internal combustion engine work by burning different petrols in cardboard tubes. But is the writer correct? At this point it seems very unclear. The book so far is more a matter of the writer reporting on the basic form of the criticisms and the basic form of the responses. But there is multiple repetition of the same assertion that the critics just did not look properly at the details. What we really need is some more details. Start of paraphrase. Section 17, Negating the art using bodies and tin. Several people have analysed tin as follows. The two tins are blue tin and white tin. The blue tin is similar to the sun, that is gold. The white tin is similar to the moon, that is silver. So they say that tin, that is Jupiter, is similar to the moon, different only in sound, softness and melting. The creak that is heard from it is taken to be from the quicksilver separating its particles to make it more fluid. They calcined, that is heated and pulverized and repeated until no further change occurs, the bluish tin and obtained a white calx which would reduce no further, but they found that the creak, softness and liquefaction were the same as before, and so declared no hardening of tin can be done. But some have calcined and reduced and removed the scoria and used a great fire. They produced something that was harder and without creak. But despite this partial success, the liquefaction had not been removed, so they declared that tin into silver cannot be done. But to properly modify tin, one needs medicines. Some people agree with that, but have tried some medicines and getting no transmutation just gave up on that point, declaring grumpily that it could not be done. End of paraphrase. Because of the belief in the incorrectness of any method of transmutation in the 21st century mindset, it can be hard to appreciate the point that Pseudo Geber is making here. On the one hand, the critics have a point. After trying various heat treatments and impurities in tin over the years of trying, they have failed to produce a substance that passes an assay as silver, hence the conclusion, in at least a practical sense, that it is not possible. Is this not reasonable? The problem is context and presumed theory. At the time, the modern set of elements was not part of the theory. In some sense, the modern set of chemical elements, those that were established at the end of the 19th century, that I like to call the elements of classical chemistry, were simply a summary of the discovery of what you could and could not transmute in an alchemical furnace. A discovery that was the accumulated data from several centuries of trying. Pseudo Geber was working at the very start of the process, as far as it existed in Europe anyway. So what we have in the 14th century are two metals, tin and silver, that are rather similar. But one is noisy, soft and easy to melt, as well as being cheap, while the other is quiet, relatively harder and not so easy to melt, and in particular rather expensive. Brittle iron, by the addition of impurities, in medieval alchemy terms the use of medicines, can be made into tough steel, or by the addition of chromium into stainless steel. These metals actually behave in very different ways. The development of the understanding of the state diagram iron with impurities took centuries to reach the form that it has in the 21st century. Long failure to find an artificial form of silk does not mean that nylon was impossible. Europe for a long time tried without success to find a method to make strong, attractive ceramics of the kind that could be purchased from China. Today, several countries pour billions of dollars into an attempt to make a fusion reactor. The attempts have been going on for a better part of a century. This does not mean that one can never validly, grumpily declare that something is impossible, but the idea that silver might be the result of heat-treating tin with addition and subtraction of impurities is not a fundamentally implausible one, given the information at the time. Pseudo Geber, thus, also has a valid point, that there is a vast collection of possible processes involving burning, sublimating, calcining, mixing and medicating, and that people who are declaring that alchemy cannot ever have a success have explored but a very small part of the space of such process. Start of paraphrase. Page 659, supposition from lead. Section 18. The same fantasy is made by people who study Saturn, except that it does not break bodies and it returns from its kelps faster than Jupiter. But they cannot remove its lividity because they do not know how. They cannot whiten with good whitening by means of this fantasy, nor can they unite it stably in stable bodies without it receding from the mixture due to forceful expression of fire. End of paraphrase. This is almost not a paraphrase, as the jargon is deeper. Saturn means lead, Jupiter means tin. There are 7 classical metals and 7 classical planets, so an association was made. There are also 7 days to the week across cultures. Some writers believe the 7 days came from the 7 planets assigned in Mesopotamia, and then the idea spread across the Eurasian continent. Lividity is a bluish discoloration of the skin after death. It is a sign of pooling of blood after death, hence I interpret this as meaning the bluish element of its colour. Calx is what is left of a metal ore after heating. One theory was that metal was calx and spirit. Later this was calx and phlogiston. In the context of phlogiston, interpreted as negative oxygen, that means that calx is a metal oxide. This issue, calx of mercury, is central to the history of the often called Second Chemical Revolution around the turn of the 19th century. In some cases, the calx can be highly hygroscopic or easy to decompose, and so after creating a calx, it undergoes a spontaneous change back to what it originally was. Chambers seems to use it a bit more generally. Chambers, under alum, page 67. Alum dissolves in water, and what remains undissolved at bottom is a sort of calx, which dissolves readily enough in oil or spirit of vitriol, and hence there arises some doubt whether alum, as it does not leave an earth behind, does properly belong to the class of salts. Mr. Boyle assures us that alum ore, robbed of its salt, does in tract of time recover it again in the air. End of quote. The definition of calx in Chambers, page 142, Cam. Calx literally signifies lime or a stone burnt or calcined in a kiln for that purpose, to be used in the making of mortar, etc. See lime mortar, etc. Calx in chemistry is a kind of ashes or fine friable powder, which remains of metals, minerals, etc. after they have undergone the violence of the fire for a long time, and by that means have lost all their humid parts. Or calx is what remains of a body after calcination. Gold and silver, after they have been reduced to a calx, may be again recovered to their former form and nature. Calx of tin is called putty, of considerable use in polishing steel mirrors, etc. Calx of brass is called astum. Calx of lead is called cerus, see cerus. For calx of antimony, see antimonium diaphoreticum. For calx in anatomy, see calcaneus. End of quote. Tin oxide is used in the 21st century as a polishing powder, including in tumbling semi-precious stones. It is possible that gold, being an unreactive metal, did not oxidize in the alchemical furnace. Hence, the calx of gold might not be gold oxide, but rather just particles of gold in a coarse powder. Johannes Agricola, in Treatise on Gold, has some comments on calx of gold and its properties. Do not confuse Johannes Agricola with Georgius Agricola, who wrote De Re Metallica and was not fond of traditional alchemy. Getting back to the passage in Summa Perfectionis Magisterii. I'm not entirely sure what "they cannot remove its lividity" means, but I would hazard the guess that it refers to the idea that lead is corroded silver. Silver turns slightly yellow and might turn light purple, or some see it as a purple-blue, before turning black as it corrodes. Lead tarnish may be more grey than black, but when freshly cut it is said to have a bluish tint. Hence Pseudo Geber is saying that the people who do not understand alchemy cannot remove the bluish tint from lead, which would be a step in curing it if you look at it as sick silver. That is, if lead is corroded, corrupted, or impure silver. Then removing the blue is a step in the right direction. Pseudo Geber also says, they cannot whiten with good whitening by means of this fantasy, which appears to be the next stage in that lead is more grey than silver is. And finally, nor can they unite it stably in stable bodies without it receding from the mixture due to forceful expression of fire. This point is quite important in respect of trying to manufacture gold and silver. It was recognized generally that brass is made from, say, copper and zinc, and it looks rather like gold, but is clearly not gold because when it is heated, the copper and zinc liquefy at different temperatures and separate. Various fake golds were known, but they all would separate out into their components on heating. This was one reason to suppose that gold and silver were prime metals. They do not separate out, regardless of how hot the furnace was made up to the technological limitations of the time. The argument is sound, but also it's not conclusive. Perhaps higher temperatures would work, or perhaps higher temperatures plus a catalyst or a medicine would do it. This is not dissimilar to the hopeful construction of larger and larger particle accelerators in the 20th and 21st centuries. In my own view, the idea of transmuting lead into silver by chemical means in a benchtop furnace was only given the boot by the advent of quantum theory in the 20th century. It then was possible to derive mathematically which chemicals were elemental and hence could not be converted by mechanical, electrical or chemical means. Of course, they could be converted by nuclear means. Even in the context of desktop experiments, you could do this with uranium and very little tech. Start of paraphrase. And this is what especially deceives them in its preparation while using only this method. It receives after two reductions from its calx more softness rather than hardness. In this way it is less like silver, but it also improves in other ways. They do not think about that, so they declare that alchemy does not work. Similarly, some look to manufacture metals by mixing a harder body with a softer body to try to get something between. But when this is done, the two bodies are not joined in a stable manner. Mixing Sol with Luna and Venus does not create Sol and Luna from Venus, but the fire will still separate them. Some remain in mixture, more or less, but not entirely stable. End of paraphrase. And again, the issue is really not so much that people are not providing evidence against the principle of transmutation of prime metals, but that Pseudo Geber is objecting to the assertion that the art has been entirely refuted. This is rather like people trying to invent nylon by using catgut and horsegut, and having failed, claimed it was impossible, but the correct approach is to use cellulose. The problem for me here is that this point is made too many times. Pseudo Geber is saying, these people failed and declared it is impossible, but they did not understand the complexity of the matter. Again and again. Repeating this seems to add little to the justification of the art. The assertion that the opponents of alchemy are obviously delusional is not being well supported here. It can only really be supported by showing something that works, to show that the others have misapplied it. What we really need is to find out about the details of alchemy and what actually works. Some details were at least hinted at. For example, pointing out that a technique that failed to make lead harder did make it more like silver in other ways. But the focus should have been on these points. However, there is only a little more of this. Start of paraphrase. Some have tried treating the mixture of hard and soft in various ways. These people have used both additives and heat treatment, but several have been fooled into thinking that they have a stable mixture when they do not. After finding this out, they deny the art. Still others have looked at glass or gems. However, neither mix properly with metals unless it is to produce a final product that is a glass. Hence, this has not worked either. But they had worked with the wrong kinds of materials. There are those that suppose that salts, alums, niters and boraxes are the key to transmuting the prime metals. This does not work either, not on its own in simple cases. It is possible to find from this some results, but it is very difficult to obtain. Those who say that vegetable matter can be used are saying something plausible, but these people do not achieve it and hence claim it is impossible. End of paraphrase. Keep in mind that Pseudo Geber is talking about the people who have declared that transmutation of the 7 classical metals is impossible. Of course, the main interest was in manufacture of gold and silver, but the concept involves as well, say, copper into tin, or even silver into lead. Pseudo Geber states that those people who have given up and declared it impossible have, in his analysis, all used techniques that were to focus on one aspect of alchemy and not really understood the art as a whole. It remains now to see how Pseudo Geber will describe that which is supposed to be the correct theory and practice of alchemy.